What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Testament, Order of High Human, which is a first-person action adventure that focuses on both combat as well as some puzzle solving. Before we dive in further, though, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes more than that. If you look at the description below, you'll find a video explaining everything that I go over, and my Steam profile is public and linked below as well. Furthermore, for this particular game, I did receive a review copy for this, as this video is going up at, I believe, the time the game is launching, if not a couple hours before, but roughly in there. That said, I personally have had my hands on the game for about a week, if you're wondering how that was possible. But from there, let's actually dive into this thing. As I mentioned, this is a first-person action adventure with a lot of focus on both combat and puzzles. The devs and the publisher, Fairy Ship Games, have advertised that this game is inspired by a lot of titles, but is very much so trying to recreate the feel of more retro titles like Dark Messiah of Might and Magic, in addition to some distinctive Metroidvania elements. So needless to say, we have a lot to cover. For newly released games, I like to start the video off with a bit of a note on the technical state of the game, and I personally didn't really have too many problems in the way of bugs or anything like that. Most of what I ran into was very minor stuff that was easily fixed with just a quick reload, and the game auto-saves and uses a checkpoint system, so you're never really losing that much progress. But probably the biggest thing to mention in this regard was something that was actually frustrating me about the game in terms of its controls until I started playing it on the Steam Deck, which uses controller support, where the problem disappeared. So I noticed when using a keyboard and mouse, which is important because this game is releasing on PC and nowhere else, that you cannot sprint and run at the same time. And some of the puzzles you'll be solving are platforming puzzles, and in order to make some of the longer jumps, you need to sprint and jump to do so. But as I mentioned, on PC with keyboard and mouse, sprinting and jumping doesn't work. You have to let go of the sprint, which kills your momentum and makes the jump harder. You can still do it with some very precise timing, but it's difficult. And this is something I was having a lot of problems with as I moved through the game. But when I tried playing the game on the Steam Deck, this problem suddenly goes away and you can jump while sprinting. And that, I would say, is by far the largest issue this game has, is that if you're not playing on controller, the platforming is going to be very rough. I died more to falling into things from botched jumps because of this than I ever did to enemies throughout this entire review. So if you're going to play this, I would actually recommend a controller, even as someone who is pretty much keyboard and mouse all the way, because that is by far this game's biggest problem, though there are a couple of other minor things we'll get into across the review itself. Now, from there, let's talk difficulty a little bit. The game never asks you about difficulty, but it defaults to normal. There are, however, 3 difficulties: easy, normal, hard. Pretty much the standard stuff you would expect. You take more damage, enemies have more health. Mostly I just wanted to mention it because the option is a little bit buried, it's not kind of put in your face. From there, though, let's talk about the story setup for this game. In this particular title, we play as a man named Aaron, who has recently found himself stripped of all his power by his brother Arva, who has usurped the throne of High Humans from you. You used to be the king of the immortal race known as the High Humans. This was effectively a group of people that was elevated above regular mortals and tasked with safeguarding the realm of Tessara until the Seekers could return. Your brother Arva is using his new position of power to corrupt the land, turn mortals into monsters, and otherwise just spread darkness, while planning his own nefarious ends. Naturally, you'd like to put a stop to this and spend the game fighting your way through hordes of enemies to do just that. A single run through the story is probably going to run you about 20 hours, roughly 25-ish, to see everything in one go, as the game does have a fair bit of optional content. Now, as far as the quality of that story goes, the story and the world itself are pretty interesting. I was curious about the world that they had built here. However, while the story is fine, it's probably worth a mention that the writing is a little bit awkward, with some of the dialogue and back and forth just being not quite right, like words that you probably wouldn't use, that kind of thing, and it just leads to the whole of the conversations tending to feel, again, just a little bit awkward, which is coupled by voice acting that is okay at best. which means while the plot was relatively interesting, some of the way in which that story was told could at times feel a little clumsy, though overall I did find it interesting. Next up, let's talk character progression. As we move through the game, we will be leveling up as we complete quests, defeat enemies, that kind of thing. Every time we level up, we earn a perk point that we can put into this tree. Perks do two things at the same time. They both unlock a new ability, as well as upgrading your stats. The damage you deal with weapons is done off of a short calculation, and basically, the perk tree is divided up into magic, sword, and bow, and each of those perks will give you bonuses to the appropriate stats, making you better at them damage-wise. Though these perks also unlock more useful things like the ability to chain together combos and end them with a magical attack, letting you slow time with a bow, or just various magical abilities that will make your life easier. Some of these abilities on the perk tree, however, are tied to story progression, which is where some of the Metroidvania elements come in, and then there are actually a few secret bosses towards the end of the game that you can unlock and fight, that the ultimate spells in the game require you to defeat the associated secret boss in order to actually use the magic. That's the bulk of the character progression right there. There is a little bit of story-related stuff where you'll pick up certain weapons that will allow you to do certain things, which again contributes to some of the more Metroidvania elements, so something to keep in mind. That though brings us to the gameplay section of the video. The beginning of the game is fairly linear. Overall, I would say you are going to be moving through about 4 or 5 distinct levels, so to speak, with the first one being pretty linear in its nature as you kind of move through the story before things open up, at which point you'll be able to unlock fast travel points and go back and forth to places you've been before as you try to track down side quests or just learn more about the world in general. So outside of the first area, the later parts of the game are larger, more explorable areas that you can find secrets in, run around, do side quests, etc. That said, progressing further into the story and unlocking certain abilities will allow you to traverse secret paths, things like that. Most of this is tied to the bow, with you getting extra abilities that allow you to hit certain types of enemies, that kind of thing, alongside of just a few other abilities that let you interact with certain points, so you can move past obstacles or uncover more secrets. So there is a tiny bit of backtracking, but thankfully, due to the fast travel system, this is mostly streamlined and you can target exactly what you're looking for, which makes the extra exploration and discovery, if you will, of the side content pretty targeted, and it's not really looking to waste your time or anything. But then there's the platforming sections. As I mentioned, the game primarily focuses on combat and puzzles. Much of the game is wandering through areas that will lead you into combat encounters or just exploring. However, there are parts of the game that are series of platforming puzzles primarily, and while the puzzles themselves aren't particularly difficult, this is where if you're not playing on a controller, you're probably going to have a really bad time with the jumping, because as I mentioned earlier, on keyboard and mouse, for whatever reason, sprinting and jumping just will not work, which is going to make some of these platforming sections a real nightmare. Usually found in and around these, however, there are these sort of light puzzles you have to solve, some of which are tied to chests out in the regular world, but oftentimes during these platforming sections you'll find many of these where you have to direct a light around a small puzzle as well, so the platforming isn't the only puzzle involved. And while much of this is simple enough, there also isn't really any way around much of this, which means if you don't like that kind of thing, you'll probably hate these parts of the game. Luckily though, as I mentioned, there is a checkpoint save system. You won't be manually saving anything, but the game itself will autosave frequently, as well as keep autosaves for a given playthrough at key moments. So you're always able to load back to a previous save if you want to go track something down in particular, which helps if you want to 100% the game per se once you get towards the end. But otherwise, the game just autosaves pretty frequently at certain points. That said, let's talk about combat, the other large part of this game. Combat is what I would consider a mid-tempo hack and slash. The main problem with combat is what we'll start with, and that is the fact that it lacks weight. There is kind of no impact to the things you are doing in melee combat specifically. When you are hitting things with your sword, the second hit in a combo will stagger an enemy, but it's usually very quick, and otherwise enemies don't really respond to what you're doing. And because of that, it can be harder to engage with the rest of combat systems, which involve timing and combos, which we're about to get into. Otherwise, combat is primarily divided up into your sword, your bow, and magic. If you're using your sword in melee combat, this comes down to performing combos, which you unlock by getting their appropriate perk. This is going to allow you to chain light and usually end with a heavy attack to perform certain magical combos at the end of your sword swings. This can be augmented, so to speak, by timing your clicks appropriately at the end of your initial swing to flow naturally into the next one, and this will speed up the rate at which you are actually fighting with the sword. Otherwise, it's a little slower. The combo system itself I like. As you unlock longer combos, you can do, say, 2 sword attacks that are light, and then use a heavy attack to unleash like a blast that will knock an enemy back. Or if you do 3 light attacks and then a heavy attack, it will instead do a big AoE explosion in front of you. There's a couple others as well, but generally the combo system and the timing of those combo systems is something fun to engage with, but it runs into that problem of the lack of weight to any of it, which can make it hard to deal with bosses in particular, as it makes the whole thing feel just awkward. But then we have the bow. Over the course of the game, we're going to upgrade the bow and get all sorts of types of arrows, such as explosive or soul arrows, which pass through things, and even reflective arrows, which are a big part of certain puzzle solving, though in combat they are less useful. As you increase your bow perks, it will allow you to hold more and more arrows, which are more useful in combat. Most combat areas, though, do have little bow stands sitting around that will allow you to grab arrows, which is important because some enemies can only be hit with ranged attacks, especially the darkness eyes, some of which can protect enemies from damage while they exist, which means you need to shoot them pretty quick, so you need to have access to arrows for that. But being able to slow down time with a bow will help you out quite a bit here, especially later when you're dealing with tons and tons of enemies. But then we have our magic. Magic is divided up into 5 types of elements, and you can equip 1 spell to each hand, which will allow you to cast various spells, some of which are more offensive in nature. Some will be like a shield that bars you from taking damage for a short time, which was very helpful, but for the most part you just shoot the magic. In addition to this, however, enemies will of course have resistances and weaknesses, which can be figured out by using insight, which is basically a sort of special vision you can activate as a high human that will highlight the weak spot on an enemy, provided you have insight in use. While you're actually in combat, you usually can't use it for very long, with it simply disappearing when you actually go to start using your abilities. But this is useful for highlighting the specific weak point on an enemy where you can use a bow to kill them, which is where stealth comes in. Stealth is an oddity in this game to me, because on one hand, you can stealth and one-shot enemies from behind if you manage to sneak up on them, and while that can be fun for parts of the game, later in the game you're going to find yourself trapped in sort of combat arenas a lot, where you're immediately detected by the enemy, at which point stealth becomes basically unusable. So while it's pretty useful in the beginning, I did find that stealth became less and less of a factor the more I moved farther into the game. Lastly on this front though, we have the consumables. As you move through the game, you'll be picking up a currency called Shards of Creation. You can use these to craft consumables you've discovered, some of which will just augment your damage to ridiculous degrees, and using these consumables against bosses is what's going to make all of the difference there. Overall for combat though, I would say it has a lot of good ideas, some things I really enjoyed like the combo system, and in combination with the magic and using arrows at strategic times, you get to a point where you can have a pretty good bit of fun with it. But the main issue for me is it just kind of lacks any real weight. It really just feels like I'm swinging through nothing most of the time, which can lead to a fair few unsatisfying moments, even if I enjoyed the bulk of the combat. From there, I want to talk about Steam Deck compatibility. This game works pretty well on the Steam Deck, though there are a few things to note. One, the game does have cloud save support, and it does have controller support, so you should be fine there. However, it is likely to pull forward your PC configurations if you're going from PC to Steam Deck, which means in my case, the game kept trying to load up at 4K on the Steam Deck, which obviously didn't work very well, so you'll likely have to watch out for that and deal with it accordingly. Once you get that fixed though, and you mess around with the settings a little bit, you can get to a decent place. And given the fact that the jumping problem is solved on Steam Deck, this very much so might be a more enjoyable experience for the Steam Deck as a platform than it is on an actual PC, to be frank. But outside of just having to adjust the settings every time I launched it, it was pretty enjoyable. That though brings us to our positive positives and negatives, and then we will wrap this thing up. For the positives, I would say the world is interesting and I really enjoyed exploring. There's a decent amount of optional content and you can find all this lore about what went down when the world sort of ended. And a lot of that was interesting to read and parse through, and that's where I was having the most fun. Combine that with a decent amount of approaches to combat, and I was having fun more often than I wasn't. But nonetheless, there were times I was not really having fun, which brings us to our negatives. The combat towards the end of the game kind of devolves into these slogs of combat arenas where they just keep throwing enemy after enemy at you, which by itself is going to void some of the approaches you might have been using to get to that point. And with the lack of weight, especially with the melee combat, can lead to, I would say, a fair bit of frustration into getting to grips with the combat, which is a shame because it has a lot of good ideas. It just lacks a certain degree of polish. Which brings me to my other main negative, which is simply a lack of polish in general. Some of the writing isn't quite up to snuff. Some of the voice acting is a little bit off. The stuff with the combat that I just mentioned. The strange issues with the running and jumping on keyboard and mouse, which suddenly isn't an issue when you're using a controller. Just little things like that I think hamper an otherwise pretty decent experience. And I think when it comes to recommending this game, a lot of that comes down to how much you think any of that stuff is going to bother you. Because ultimately, this is an indie game. It was made by a small 15-man team that was self-published. It is very much so an indie title. But nonetheless, there are things about this game that are likely to frustrate most people. And while overall, I would say I had more fun than I didn't, when it comes to a conclusion for this title, I'll say this. I don't have access to the pricing information. They did not tell me. Chances are if this game went live at the same time this video did, you might already know that before I did. But for me, my willingness to overlook some of this game's problems really come down to how much it costs. If the game is in like the $20 to $30 range, that might not be such a big deal for people. But if it's in the like $40 range, that would be a buy on sale from me. And given the content and overall approach of the game, I would say they're probably going to price this around $40, or at least that's what I would expect in my experience, which means for me at that price point it would be a buy on sale given everything we've just covered in this review. But if it happens to go up for something cheaper like $20-$25, then yeah, you could probably have a pretty good time for that price, provided you're mindful of the issues I mentioned. But beyond that, it's a bit of a janky game that lacks some polish, even if it does have a few good ideas. That is going to do it for today's video though. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.